Are we ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay. For starters, my name is Milton Mannis. Most people call me Milt. I was born in New York City, actually Brooklyn. My parents got married here. They were both immigrants. My father came from what was then Russia and what later became Poland. My mother came from what was then Austria. So I said they met and got married here. So I went to public schools, mostly around New York City, in various parts of New York City. Then I went to a rather good high school. It was called Townsend Harris. It's now defunct and people are trying to revive it unsuccessfully. But it was affiliated with City College. And Townsend Harris was a pretty high-class high school. We had for the most part, very good teachers. As a matter of fact, the chap that taught me French was a chap named Mario Pei, who became a professor of languages at Columbia University and was one of the 2 or 3 leading linguists in the world. He was my teacher during the Depression days before he had gotten a PhD at Columbia. So these are my recollections of Townsend Harris High School. Well, it turns out that they didn't teach chemistry in high school there, but they did teach physics. And there were 2 teachers who taught physics, and both of them were sort of eccentric and not very good. But very fortunately, I had a couple of student teachers. And these student teachers were full of beans and very enthusiastic. Well, I found physics to be a real eye-opener. Great course. I just lapped that stuff up. I like mathematics, but physics was just great stuff. It's interesting, at that time, there were a couple of things they explained to us I didn't quite believe. So I thought about that. But anyway, I went from Townsend Harris High School right into City College. That was in 1933. I wasn't quite 15 years old. And in those days, there wasn't any trauma about which college you were going to go to. I had a very simple choice. It was either City College or it was nothing. And at that time, tuition was free, and we could afford every bit of it. This is sort of during the Depression. I did have something they used to call a Regents Scholarship in New York, which paid $100 a year for 4 years, and that's what paid lab fees and a lot of other incidentals, so I was able to supplement my income a little bit. And in the summers, I would go off to the Catskills and work as a busboy and wait in the Borscht Circuit. That's where we supplement our income. But anyway, when I got to City College, it turns out that I couldn't take physics the first year because it was closed out, and so I took the introductory course in chemistry, and I thought that's pretty nice stuff too. So then I didn't know quite whether I was going to major in chemistry or in physics because they were both eye-openers, and the reason that I picked on chemistry was because I'd never heard of a physicist getting a job, which is rather interesting. Later on, I found my instructor in physics at City College. My second instructor in freshman physics was a chap named Walter Zinn, who I found out later who got his PhD with a chap named Fermi at Columbia. And the name Fermi didn't mean anything to me. Walter Zinn later on turned out to head up the Argonne National Laboratory. So this is the kind of ferment that was going on at the time that I was sort of out of. So anyway, I ended up majoring in chemistry, and since of course it was a toss-up between physics and chemistry, you might suppose that I was interested in physical chemistry. And finally, as a senior, I ended up in physical chemistry at City College. And in those days, at City College, physical chemistry attracts either the best teachers or the worst. And at City College, they were among the worst. There was an old chap who was practically senile, and there were a couple of young chaps that were lousy teachers and sadistic graders. So I listened to this lecture in physical chemistry, and as I say, my first impression of him was that he was a clod. And years later, when I became as old as he was and as experienced as he was, I thought he was a bigger clod. But the way I learned physical chemistry as an undergraduate, there was a very fine book called Getman and Daniels, and I proceeded to ignore the professor and study it right out of the book, and I found that was a joy. So there were certain things about physical chemistry that were eye-openers. For example, in qualitative analysis, there was such a thing as an Nernst equation, and it was always fascinating to me how come a galvanic potential would have an equation that would contain a gas constant in it. And later on, when I was in physical chemistry, then I learned it. So actually, they didn't teach a second semester of physical chemistry at City College at the time. But later on, when I was studying for a civil service examination, I went and I just got myself the textbook and worked through the second semester of physical chemistry on my own. Okay, well, I ended up with, I also was interested in teaching, and in those days, one's ambition was to get a job teaching in high school, and so I took a number of education courses, which in a way handicapped me a little bit because I really should have had more mathematics, and this was quite a good school of education, quite a good department of education, but I must say that of the courses I took, most were a waste of time. I think most everything I learned could have been given in one course, but I ended up doing some practice teaching, and that was an interesting experience, particularly since I was no older than most of my students. Again, what happened to me was, after I got my degree, I was taking civil service examinations, and I ended up getting a job as they call a minor laboratory apprentice in Food and Drug Administration in Washington. And I ended up taking care of a bunch of laboratory animals in the pharmacology division of Food and Drug Administration, and I was paid the princely sum of about $1,020 a year, which even back then wasn't much, but I found room and board came fairly inexpensive. In fact, I was sending a little money home out of it.